The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 4. Vulgarization and Political Decay. Chapter 3. Causes of European Decay. We have given as a capital reason for the political weakness of Europe the notion of individual freedom, as opposed to the greater solidarity of a community working together under a centralized consciousness and despotic, or at all events very powerful, control. Yet in the last chapter we have shown how illusory this independence must in practice be. But the confusion is not so real as it would seem. It is rather the notion of freedom than the fact of freedom that is, of course, in question, and it is just that idle pretense that is so wasteful and disorganizing. It is, in short, the aristocratic temper of the Achaean Greeks extended and caricatured by vast numbers of people. The aristocratic liberties of the dominant race in a small city-state applied to the whole white population of Europe has led to the impasse of white democracy. And white, European democracy is, of course, an aristocratic notion at bottom, for it is a race notion, all caste, of course, of that sort originating in the fact of race. Why Europe has never had a religion of its own, and that is naturally another great source of weakness, as weakness in mystery in the long run spells political weakness, is because of the ascendancy and persistence of this secular, aristocratic, Greco-Roman tradition that has fixed the European in a pagan, personal, non-religious mold. Let us exaggerate the circumstances of this so as to lay bare a sort of subterranean ideologic stream whose presence is usually only revealed by a sort of misty snobbishness. The 19th century John Bull, we then can say, was the proud, aristocratically minded person he was because the migratory Achaean or Dorian was of divine race, or imposed himself as such on the subject population. The heroic demigod of the Homeric saga was the distant exemplar of the beer-drinking Briton who could never be beat. It may be as well to go for a moment into the relation between class and race in the formation of the former. The classes that have been parasitic on other classes have always in the past been races. The class privilege has been a race privilege. Every white man until recently has been in full possession of a race privilege where other races of other colors were concerned, which constituted the white man as a class. The privilege was never developed to the extent that the Achaean race privilege of the Athenian citizen, for example, was. But in a general way it formed part of the consciousness of the white man. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and whiteness was the indispensable condition of cleanliness. So to be a chosen people was to be a white people. This class element in race expressed itself in the application of the term lady, for instance, to the most modest citizens of the Anglo-Saxon race. The lady and charlady is a race courtesy title. It is a class title that it was possible for her to exact on the score of race. This rudimentary fact very few poor whites have understood. They have been inclined to take these small but precious advantages for granted, as indicative of a real superiority, not one resulting, as in fact it did, from the success of the organized society to which they belonged. They have confused class with race, somewhat to their undoing. Today race and color are as distinctive features as ever, and it is unlikely in the future that race will cease to play its part in the formation of class, as, again, many simple white people will discover to their great chagrin. But the character of our civilization, as defined by the great discoveries of modern science, with their unifying effect, must tend very rapidly not only to worldwide standardization, but to racial fusion. Or rather, this must be the consequence of the new conditions, unless this process is artificially held up, and national idiosyncrasies and differences artificially preserved and fostered, as with the Jesuits in the territories they controlled in South America, each tribe locked up in its tribal district or reduction, and friendly intercourse of any sort between various tribes prohibited. The most fundamental of all questions for us, namely, war and peace, is dependent on these questions of class and race. If there were not today communities with an exclusive race consciousness, with or without sacred books, and the theologic paraphernalia of race, the future of class, too, would be much more precarious than it in fact is. The people of the United States are or have been the nearest to an egalitarian ideal because they are the most racially mixed, this in spite of all the simple jokes to the contrary. But even if race were abolished by intermixture, it would still be possible, of course, to get your class factor, and with it your organized war, by way of sex, age, occupational and other categories. The intensity of organization is increased, as Mr. Russell points out, when a man belongs to more organizations. The more classes, of which, in their various functions, he is representative, that you can make him become regularly conscious of, the more you can control him, the more of an automaton he becomes. Thus, if a man can be made to feel himself acutely, A, an American, B, a young American, C, a Middle West young American, D,
a radical and enlightened Middle West young American. E. A college-educated, etc., etc. F. A college-educated dentist who is an etc., etc. GZ. A college-educated dentist of such and such a school of dentistry, etc., etc. The more inflexible each of these links is, the more powerful, naturally, is the chain.
Or he can be locked into any of these compartments as though by magic by any one understanding the wires, in the way the Jesuits studied those things. To return to the question of the race origin of caste feeling, the notion of the gentleman as we call it today is a race notion, originating in such things as Roman citizenship and its universal aristocratical privileges. The most absurd as well as degrading spectacle that this notion has ever provided was when the Roman citizen, in fact, was in question in the time of the empire. All the wealth and power of the Roman state passed more and more into the hands of the alien freedman. The Roman began rapidly to die out, the custom of child exposure contributed largely to this, and grew daily more impoverished. But the client system kept those that remained just alive. The procedure of the allotment of food for the sportula of the client, and all the rest of the humiliating life of charity of the latest Romans, was carefully organized. So it came about that living as a numerous class of decayed gentility in the midst of luxury and wealth of imperial Rome were most of the true Romans. One emperor shipped 100,000 or so of them off to some colony. But there were still a good number of these proud, ragged remnants of republican Rome, or of cultivators of the surrounding land of original Italian stock driven to the city by the introduction of foreign slave labor on the latifundia, remaining. Class always takes with it the idea of race, then, and of some distant or recent conquest. How the notion of political personal freedom has spelt weakness in the end for Europe, so that it is not at all too much to say that that is the principal cause of its present decline, is that it is by way of this notion, through this gate, that all the disintegrating tendencies have entered.